in my mind, God said very clearly, I'm God, Jesus is my son, heaven is real, hell is real, the Bible's true, welcome to my kingdom. I knew where I came from, what I'm doing here, and where I was going. I knew that my identity wasn't a gay man.
Welcome to the Reasons to Believe podcast. My name is George Haraksin. I get to serve as a staff scholar here at Reasons to Believe. I also am a senior adjunct professor of philosophy and ethics, and we are very, very glad that you've joined us today. And right off the bat, I just want to thank you. Reasons wants to thank you for your support, your engagement, and helping us reveal God in science. I have a special guest today on the podcast, and I want to welcome him, Becket Cook. Welcome to Reasons to Believe.
Thank you. It's good to be here, George.
Well, you have a book that you publish called Change of Affection.
Yes.
And this came out
in 2019.
Is what I recall, a gay man's incredible story of redemption. I know you have talked about your testimony, your journey on many different platforms and churches and other places, but maybe for some of our audience who may not know that story, I would like to talk about it a little bit, if that's okay with you, and journey through it, and then we'll jump into some other topics as well. Now, if I remember correctly, your parents were Christians, is that correct?
Yeah, I was raised in a Catholic home, but it was interesting. It was a weird dynamic because we would go to Mass on Saturday evening. Mm-hmm. And I went to Jesuit schools my whole life, then we'd go to Mass on Saturday evening, and then on Sunday we would go to, it was during this like Catholic charismatic movement of the 70s and stuff. So we would go to this charismatic, I don't even know what to call it, assembly of people. Okay. And so we had this weird, it was like this weird kind of, rigid Catholic church thing, and then this wild charismatic thing. And so it was a mix of that. And one thing I gleaned from all that growing up was I could tell, especially with the charismatic situation, when people were praying and people were worshiping, I could tell that it was real.
You would have used that label, evangelical, or
just like, biblical Christianity.
Okay. So when would you say that, did you make a transition sort of, just a Christmas and Easter Catholic, or, by high school or something? Did you have a transition at some point?
No, I was, as long as I was living in my parents' home, I had to go to Mass with them every weekend. So that wasn't a question. But in high school, I was completely checked out of the idea of Mass. I would go to Mass just to please my parents, but in high school, I was already developing same-sex attraction and having all these kind of experiences. And so I wasn't interested in church in high school. That was the last thing on my mind.
Yeah. So, and you kind of point to it there. The book is titled A Change of Affection. It's interesting. It's not a change of feeling. It's a change of affection. Maybe talk a little bit about what your affections were like at that point. You talked about same-sex attraction, and then eventually that shifted when you had a religious experience.
Yeah. Well, I developed, I think I don't know how young I was, but I was very young when I started to realize, it was probably like 9 years old, maybe 8 years old. I started to realize I was older than that, but I was attracted to the same sex, which was a strange feeling to have because, in my family, growing up in Dallas, Texas, it was very, very, very taboo to even have those feelings, So I had to keep it pretty secret, and then so I lived this double life. So in elementary school and in high school, I dated girls. I had serious girlfriends in high school, but I knew the whole time that it was just, for me, it was just a social thing to date these girls in high school. But for them, it was like, they thought it was real. And the whole time I was like, this is not real. Yeah. And then in high school, that's when I met my best friend in high school. And when I was a junior, he was a sophomore. And we both had same-sex attraction. And so we ended up coming out to each other, and that's when the doors just, opened wide. And we started going to gay bars together in Dallas and to nightclubs, and that was a crazy experience. I mean, my first time at a drag show in the gay area of Dallas, I was so shocked. I was 14 years old, and I was at this drag show, which is, by the way, I mean, I can't imagine these young kids experiencing that, because I was 14 or 15, and when I saw these drag queens doing their thing, it was like very scary to me and jarring. Even though I was same-sex attracted, it was like, what is going on? This is crazy. And it was so dark and scary and weird.
Now, so some people might, especially today, when you use those labels, that might really pick their ears. Dark, scary, weird.
Well, it was.
Well, and that's part of your experience. And when you use this word affections, what are you meaning there?
My affections were, with men, and my affections were of everything worldly, of this world. And so, that's why, I moved to LA after, I was supposed to go to law school and stuff, and I didn't go. But I moved to LA to write and act, and all my friends were in the business too. And so those were my affection. I always say we all wanted the same three things in life. Our affections were, number one, make it big in Hollywood. So that was and they all did. They all became huge stars and very successful. Number two, find true love. And so I cycled through so many boyfriends in LA, and five serious boyfriends. And it felt like I was married and divorced 5 times. That's how serious these relationships were. And then the third affection was having extraordinary experiences. Because that's what, I mean, all of my friends they were so smart, so funny, so extroverted, outgoing. And so we would just go to all the things, all the parties, all the premieres, movie premieres, and the Oscars, the Emmys, Golden Globes, Grammys, and all that. So that was part of the affection, is the shiny objects. So my world, and I loved it. That was, I had boyfriends, and then I had, great friends, and then I had great, times out at all these places, meeting everyone in Hollywood. And so, I was doing well in my career. So with acting and writing, it kind of didn't fully take off, although I ended up acting in a ton of commercials, but and the writing, I sold 2 projects, but they didn't go to series, so that was a big disappointment. And I wrote a couple of spec screenplays that were gonna get made, but then they didn't. And so that was that was my world, and those were my affections. It was just all worldly stuff. It's like Plato's cave. It's like I was in Plato's cave. And you think that's the reality. You think the shadows on the wall are the reality. And, when I got saved and came out into the light, it was like, wait a minute. Wait, this is reality. And so that, yeah.
Much you warmed my heart mentioning Plato's cave, But there's a parallel to that in the opening chapter of the Gospel of John, right? Where here it is, the Logos is the creator of the world, and he comes into the world, and the world doesn't recognize the light. And in fact, you read through the gospel, what do? They want to kill the light at the end of the thing. But there's these parallels to Plato's cave. And you had this interesting experience where you went into a coffee shop this time, not a bar, but a coffee shop, and there were some people there that you started up a conversation with, right? Is that basically?
Well, the first thing that happened was this young guy, he was probably 30, walks out. He gets his coffee, and he's walking out on the patio of this coffee shop, and I see he's got a giant book in his hand, and it says Romans on the spine of it. And so I knew enough about, Christianity that I knew that was like something about Romans in the Bible, the epistle to the Romans. So that was shocking. And then he went over to a table right next to us with young people at the table, and they all had Bibles on the table, and he chatted with them. So it was obvious like they knew each other, and they probably went to the same church or something. I didn't know. So we ended up in a conversation. I was with my best friend at the time, and we ended up in this conversation with these kids. And I always say it's like a evangelical Christian's fantasy come true when a gay atheist is like, "Hey, what's Christianity?" And tell me the gospel. Like, yeah. And so I literally turned to them and I said, "What are you guys Christians?" And they said yes. And I said, what are the tenets of? I don't even remember. Like, tell me the tenets of your faith. Like, what do you believe?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so we had this great conversation for an hour, and then, of course, I get to the $64,000 question, and I say, "Well, what does your church in Hollywood believe about homosexual behavior?" And they said, "I didn't say homosexual behavior; I just said homosexuality, because I wouldn't have used that term, pre-Christ." But and they said, "Well, we believe it's a sin," and I was just. I wasn't surprised by their response. I assumed they were going to say that, but I was surprised by my response looking back on it because if I had heard them say that to me 5 years before that, I would have been like, "You guys are crazy," and it was nice meeting you, but I'm going to go back to my coffee. But
so something had changed?
Something had changed because 6 months before, I used to go to fashion weeks in New York and Paris, and at this particular week, I was, I went to a bunch of the shows. They have after parties. I was at an after party, and I just felt, while I was there, I mean, everyone from the fashion world was there, and I just felt this overwhelming sense of emptiness. And I was like, whoa. And I was drinking champagne, looking out at the crowd. Everyone's dancing, having the times of their lives. And I'm just like, this is not it anymore. Like, I've been doing this kind of thing since high school. I've been going to all these fabulous things, and it has sustained me until now. 2000, and this was 2009 when in Paris Fashion Week, and so that was kind of a turning point for me, because that was like a moment of, what is life like? How am I going to get through the rest of my life without any kind of stable foundation? Because I can't just keep going to parties and keep, going all these things. It's just like, after a while, the law of diminishing returns sets in. And so that's why, because 6 months later was the coffee shop moment.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I just was, when they told me that it was a sin, I wasn't shocked, and I kind of just accepted it, because I'm like, I'm open to hearing something new at this point in my life. And so, and then they invited me to their church the following Sunday. I said, well, I don't know if I'll go, just give me the address. And because it was a risky thing to do, because it's like, if any of my other friends had found out I'd gone to an evangelical church, they would have thought I was crazy. So, and it would have been very embarrassing, even though my best friend was with me that day, but he would have never told my other friends about this. So it was risky to do it, but I was like, I'm just going to do this. And so I went to that church on the following Sunday, and I had no idea what I was getting into. No idea at all. I had never been to an evangelical church.
Especially a contemporary one, maybe.
Yeah. And so I walked in, and the worship band was playing. I sat down. The pastor comes out after, half an hour of music or whatever. And he comes out and starts preaching on Romans. And hence the commentary. And so I just was like totally riveted to the sermon. I was like, what this guy is saying, whatever he's saying is true, and I don't know why it's true. And I was just on the edge of my seat the entire time. And I didn't want him to stop speaking after an hour. I was just like, keep talking. And then after the sermon, someone prayed for me on the side of the auditorium.
So you went for prayer? Yeah,
I went over. I actually walked over because I was, and that was another thing. That was another like risky moment because I'm like, this could be humiliating because the people who invited me here are probably watching me. And, what if nothing happens? And this is all just, and it's just going to be embarrassing. And so I walked over to this guy on the side of the auditorium. He was on the prayer ministry. And I said, well, I don't know what I believe, but I'm here. Again, like a Christian's fantasy come true. So he prayed for me. And then I thanked him. I went back to my seat, and that's when it all went down. And so while I sat down, everyone else was standing and singing and worshiping for another 25 minutes. And as soon as I sat down because I was just like, I was so overwhelmed by the sermon, the prayer, the music, and I just sat down and I was like, what is happening? And then all of a sudden, just the Holy Spirit just opened, everything.
Emotionally open?
I opened my eyes. So
your eyes, okay.
So in that, it was like a road to Damascus kind of moment. It was so intense. It was the most intense thing that's ever happened to me in my life. And God, in that moment, in my mind, God said very clearly, not audibly, but it was so clear. It was like God's like, he said, I'm God, Jesus is my son, heaven is real, hell is real, the Bible's true, welcome to my kingdom. And I started bawling and bawling. I was doubled over, just crying and crying and crying and couldn't stop. For the next 25 minutes, I was crying, and I was crying so hard that people around me were concerned. They thought they were going to call a medic to come see if I was okay. And then it happened again when I got home after the service. I got into bed to take a nap because I was so freaked out. And then God's like more of, like, he just showed me more of his glory or whatever himself, or he revealed more. And I burst into tears. And I jumped out of bed, and in the middle of my bedroom, I said, God, you have my whole life. I'm yours. I'm done. This is it. And I knew in that moment that homosexual behavior was a sin. I knew that it was wrong. I knew that it was no longer part of my future, but I didn't care because I just met Jesus. And I'm like, I'm going with that guy. Good riddance to those old, guys. And that was September 20th, 2009. And I never looked back.
So there was a sense there, the way I'm hearing it, that you were being filled up, to use a phrase, in a new way. You're attributing, obviously, to God, that this is a new experience of meaning, purpose. I don't know, what other words would you put to it, in contrast to what you experienced at the Paris fashion show that you described, 6 months earlier or so.
It was like, and it was incredible. It felt like when Paul says, I once knew a man who was caught up in the third heaven, which he's talking about himself. It was like the curtains had parted and I could finally see the meaning of life. I knew what the meaning of life was, which was so amazing. And I felt so much like just this love, the enormous amount of love, but also conviction of sin. So I was crying over the conviction of sin, but also just the joy of what was happening. It was so... It was so crazy. It was like, I wish I could re-experience that because it was so good. Yeah, it was just this flood of just love and warmth and finally I knew who I was. I knew my identity, and I knew that my identity wasn't a gay man. I knew where I came from, what I'm doing here, and where I was going. It was all, God was so gracious to me. Like, it all was just like the first day. I mean, some people, it takes time for them to figure things out. God just was like, he just downloaded all the truth in my mind and my heart. And I was like, okay, like, this is great. Wow. I love it.
That's amazing. I think it was St. Augustine who talked about having that double knowledge. The first thing is recognizing sin, how bad a sinner I might be, but at the same time experience how much grace, how loving of a God that is before me. And you can actually have both of those experiences at the same time.
That's what was happening. Yeah.
Hearing that story could fear a lot of loneliness or hurt, not having those friendships anymore. What was that like for you?
Well, my friends, when I told each one of them one at a time. I took like a month or a few weeks to sit everyone down one at a time and say, guys, I have something really crazy to tell you. And they just were so shocked, that I was most of my friends at that point, they didn't know much about, they just were kind of like, or I'm happy that you found your path sort of thing. And so they weren't really hostile, except there were a couple exceptions of friends who got very hostile to me, especially about the gay part. And so, but I didn't, and what's weird is, I was doing production design and I would go on the set of all these shoots with, these fashion shoots. And I would just like talk about Jesus the whole time to all these people, to the actresses or the singer, whatever, whoever we were shooting. I would just say, Jesus, oh my gosh, it's real. Jesus is real. And I thought I was going to get canceled, for years. And I thought, they're going to call my agent and say that Beckett's insane. He's talking about, he's a Jesus freak on the set, with like Oprah and all these people. And so, but it's weird because God kind of had me in this protective bubble for so long. And it wasn't until my book came out in 2019 that I got canceled in Hollywood. And because it's like one thing to talk about it kind of locally, but to have a book out, in the world is a different thing. And I got, dropped by my agents. And so, that's when I got, and then that's when my really closest friends of my life, like 3 or 4 or 5 of them, that's when they cut me off because, again, it was just like, because they're in the book and they were not pleased. I mean, I don't say anything bad about them. I just talk about our experiences together, but they were not happy that I was writing a book about this, whole thing. And my friends, we never talked about God once. We had never, ever. God never came, because God was like, it was just assumed that God didn't exist. And
so you weren't getting arguments that God didn't exist. It was just part of the ethos of your culture, if you will.
They thought, we all thought that the Bible was an ancient myth, like any other myth. But it was a shock to me. It was a shock to me that it was all real. I was just like, wow. Because by that point in my life, I mean, I was a practical atheist. I had gone through a period of agnosticism, but then at that point, at the coffee shop, I was an atheist. And so I was just so blown away by, and the fact that God did that to me the first time I went to an evangelical church, like that was just so gracious of him to do. Because, if nothing happened that day, I probably would have just, not gone back. I just would have been like, well, I tried that out. Like, that didn't work. But God had something else in mind.
Yeah. Well, let me transition a little bit. I mean, you went and ended up getting your, I think, master's. Was it a seminary or?
Talbot School of.
Oh, you went to Talbot?
Yeah, Biola.
Oh, that's where I got my master's in. But I did in philosophy and ethics, but the same.
I got my master's in theology, yeah.
Oh,
nice.
I had some of the same professors. I was there much a longer time ago.
Well, I was there from 2014 to 2017.
Yeah, I won't say when I was there. But
in the 50s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. Me in the 50s. So you were already being equipped kind of for a different part of life.
That's why, that's why, because I felt in 2013, I started feeling God was, I felt just like this strong, it was crazy, like strong pull to go to seminary. And every day it just got more and stronger and stronger. And I just was like, I felt like I was on a train to seminary and I couldn't get off. Went up to my pastor and I said, one of my pastors, and I said, I feel like God's calling me to seminary, and I don't know what to do, because if I go, I'm going to have to turn down 90% of the jobs I get.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, let me pray for you. He prayed for me. And then afterwards he said this crazy thing to me. He said, Becket, I think God's going to pay for your school, and that's going to be confirmation. And I'm like, what? Like, how's that going to happen? And of course it did happen.
Wow.
God paid for I didn't have one. I mean, he paid for all of my seminary books, classes, everything, pencils, pens. And so when I got canceled in Hollywood, I wasn't upset, because I knew God was bringing me into a more full-time ministry situation. So I wasn't even shocked that, I wasn't. Yeah, in fact, I emailed my agents, and I was just like, thank you so much for everything. I was very sweet about it. And so, and God, of course, like right after that I wrote the book, and everything started kind of working, and I knew God was doing that. So, yeah.
You were seeing his activity in your life. Really solidifying it. So in making that transition, you get connected to a church. And how eventually does it end up you now doing a podcast? Obviously, you're speaking across the country. I don't know, maybe internationally. What has been that transition, and what do you like to talk about on your podcast?
The podcast was another God thing. It was it was during the pandemic, and it was 2020, and a friend of mine was like, you should start a podcast. Or I started hearing, people started telling me, like, Becket, you need to start a podcast. And I'm like, what? I don't even know how to do a podcast. I don't even know what microphone to get. Like, and I just kept hearing it. And then the same pastor who I just talked about seminary, was at my apartment in LA, and we were talking about it, and talking about the podcast and YouTube show. And while we were talking about it, I get a phone call. There's a phone call from my former pastor, Tim Chaddock, in London. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Tim's calling right now. And Tim was really close with the other pastor I was talking to. They're like very, very close. And so Tim, I answer the phone, and the first thing he says is, Becket, you should start a podcast. Or, Becket, you should start a YouTube show. And I'm like, whoa, like, that's crazy. Like, we're literally just talking about it right now, and you're telling me I need to start. So that's kind of the genesis of it. And then I just kind of like got my iPhone, set it on a tripod, and got some lights, and just started doing it. And I didn't know if people were going to watch it. I didn't know anything. But in the beginning, for a lot of it, because I lived that life for so long, and I lived in the lies of the world for so long, the day I got saved, I mean, everything became so clear. It was like Plato's cave. I mean, everything was so clear. And once I understood the fall, once I understood the Imago Dei, everything switched in my mind. I talk about, on my show, I talk about a lot about sexuality and, same-sex attraction and that kind of stuff. So I look at kind of what the culture says versus what God says. And I examine I look, at the culture through the lens of the Bible. And because it's like that Joni Mitchell song. I've looked at life from both sides now, and so I've seen both sides, and so now I can look at the cave from outside and talk about, this is not real.
Yeah, and even in the allegory of the cave, the person who experiences the true, the good, the beautiful goes back in to try to let other people know what's out there. Yeah. Well, at Reasons to Believe, we hold this posture coming out of 1 Peter 3:15 about cultivating and honoring the virtues of gentleness and respect. And in a culture like ours, that can be a challenge in navigating things. I teach a class on applied ethics, and the minute we get to sexual ethics, everyone is uncomfortable. There's, half-cracked smiles, or no one wants to talk because they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their peers. What lies are sort of at the forefront of your mind today, and how are you navigating these waters where you have people on very, very high alert, high emotions in our culture? I'm just curious how you're navigating that. Speaking at churches out there, you're on the podcast. I don't know if you take questions on the podcast.
Yeah, I do sometimes. Yeah, I mean, the forefront of the lies is that homosexuality, there's many, but homosexual behavior is not only good, but righteous and even holy. It went from a sin to a sacrament, and from a behavior to an identity over the last 50, 60 years. And it's very clear how that happened if you just examine it. Like the culture, how power, because movies, TV shows, and movies are so powerful in our culture, and they change people's minds. Like back when I was in high school, everyone at the girls' school, everyone at the boys' school, unanimously believed homosexual behavior was wrong. They just absolutely, it was just, you didn't even have to say it. Now, some of those same people, because of the power of the culture, are allies, or post rainbow flags on their Facebook page or whatever. And so that's one of the things is I try to dispel that lie of how, suddenly, it's, chronological snobbery kind of thing. Suddenly we've decided that homosexual behavior is good. I mean, even when I was living that life, I didn't necessarily, even my best friend and I, we were both kind of like, why do gay guys want to get married? Like, we don't want to do that. That's silly, because that's not what gay guys do. They're not like domestic. And so that, and then gender stuff, all the LGBTQ plus stuff, like I address, and non-binary stuff. And this girl, I was at a conference, and this girl, young teenager, came up to me after I spoke, and she said, I'm non-binary and pansexual. And I'm like, no, you're not. And I'm like, why do you think you're that? Yeah. And she said, well, and she didn't have an answer. And I said, are you doing it for, street cred, or for popularity, or like you want attention or affirmation from your fellow students? Like, why are you non-binary? Because when I was your age, there was no such thing as that. And then she just started kind of crying, and then she ended up coming to Christ that day at the conference, which was crazy.
What are you telling, whether it's parents or other pastors or leaders of the church? How are you helping them navigate these waters?
I mean, as you said, everything is changing so quickly. It's hard to navigate them for me. I mean, it's hard to just, it's crazy how just bizarre everything's upside down in the world. And one of the things I say to parents and to family members of people who are saying like, oh, I'm, because like at Brown University, 40% of the student body said they're LGBTQ. Yeah. Like, that's not real. Yeah, that's a social contagion. Because in the in the 80s or the 80s and 90s, like at Brown, it was like 2% of the student body was gay, and so it's just I try to. First of all, we as Christians, we need to just be with our loved ones and with people we know, just be in prayer about it. Pray for, because that's what my family did. They prayed for me. My mother prayed for me for 20 years. My sister-in-law prayed for me, and my sister fasted and prayed. And so
spiritual.
And they never at once, when my parents first found out that I was quote unquote gay, we had a conversation, but that was the last time they spoke of it. And my parents were very conservative on this issue, and they believed, obviously they believed, or not so obviously, but they believed that homosexual behavior was sinful and wrong. But that was the last time we spoke of it when I was 22. And then for the rest of the time, they just prayed for me behind the scenes, and they didn't tell me they were praying for me. Because if they had told me they were praying for me, it would have been offensive to me. Because I would have been like, "Why are you praying for me? I'm fine." That, and then in terms of the social contagion aspect, I kind of urge parents or family members or pastors to push back on, just like I did with that teenage girl, to say, okay, why do you think you're this way? Why do you think you're LGBTQ? Why do you think you're queer, or queer, gender queer? Like, what makes you believe that? And then what I like to do, I often do kind of like these talks where I go through the history of how we got to where we are today. And, what's his name? Carl Truman does a great job in his book of doing that. But I go through the history of all that, and also of just like in the 80s and especially the 90s is when so many characters on TV shows were gay, and like Will and Grace and Ellen and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy later. And so that had a huge impact on the culture. And that's when people started to just be like, oh, those guys are hilarious. Like, this can't be wrong. Like, what's wrong with that? They're so fun. And I want to be their best friends. So I think that's important to do, is to show like young people, or even people my age or your age, let me just trace the history. Let me just show you what has led up to this point in time in history. Like, we don't live in a vacuum. And this wasn't an issue when I was young. Like, this wasn't a thing. And so I think that it's helpful to show people like you have these blind spots and you're not aware of them. And let me just show you what the blind spots are. So I think that's helpful.
I hear you saying helping people understand the history of how we've gone from A to B.
Yeah.
That you find that helpful for people in understanding it. Do you think, would your parents, if you chose at that time to get married, would they have attended the ceremony?
Absolutely not.
They wouldn't?
No.
Yeah. And then how do you think, well, it's hard to go back and say, because I think that's on the mind of people, of friends. And
by the way, I wouldn't have expected them to. I wouldn't have dreamt of being mad at them for not attending.
But that seems to be much more common today.
Yeah.
At least when I was pastoring, and even when I talk to students in my ethics classes, wrestling with those things. Well, you also talked about this idea of from behavior to identity, right? That homosexuality went from a set of behaviors to an identity. Can you say a little bit more about that and how that changed so dramatically for you when you came back to Christ?
Yeah. Well, in the Bible, homosexuality is always a verb in the Bible. It's not an identity. It's always a behavior. And but it's become, because of the power of the culture, it's become an identity over. And it's just, I don't know if you've read After the Ball by the two Harvard guys who they wrote After the Ball in 1980. It was published in 1989, and it was the subtitle was how to normalize. I forgot the subtitle, like how to normalize homosexuality in the culture. And it's crazy. That book is crazy because everything they talk about has come true. It's like one of the things is like, I wish I had the book here, but one of the things is like talk about homosexuality until it becomes completely tiresome, or get in the media involved, like get on media, and so it was a manifesto. It was kind of like a playbook of how to normalize this behavior, and make it an identity. When I was 22, when I lived in Tokyo after college, and so a friend visited us from Texas, and we ended up getting into a relationship. That's when it became fully my identity. Because before I just thought, this is just something a phase I'm going through, and I'll grow out of this. But no, after that, I was like, no, this is who I am, and this is like immutable, and it's going to be who I am for the rest of my life. So, making a mark on this world or doing, something, all that stuff just faded away. And I was like, I don't care. I could become a street sweeper or whatever, and it doesn't matter. Like, I'm in the kingdom of God, and I have a relationship with Jesus, and I've, eternal life, which is kind of cool.
Just kind of.
That's kind of an amazing thing. So, I didn't care about all that stuff anymore.
I was just reading the other night about the Surgeon General's report on the epidemic of loneliness. And, I've heard students say, well, I don't want my friend to be lonely, so I want to bless their relationship, or I'm sure you've heard these kinds of things. And that's a serious concern. Arguably, there's an epidemic of loneliness. There's a decrease, at least in the States, of church attendance. How do you communicate to people who are afraid of being alone? And if they have that same sex attraction, that's one way to satisfy not being alone. So I can imagine people being very fearful if they have to break that relationship, what's going to happen to them, next.
Yeah. Well, Jesus was single. Paul was single. Yeah. I get it. I mean, it is, but there's so many people who are alone who are not same-sex attracted and don't ever find a spouse, or don't ever, or whatever, that have some sort of difficulty. But, and my heart goes out to people, especially young people who are dealing with this and want to be Christians and want to follow Christ, but just see this kind of like 80 years stretched out before them, like I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. But the thing is, it's kind of, you have to switch your thinking about it, because it's like Paul again, he was single, and he ran around the Mediterranean. He was jailed, shipwrecked, beaten many times. But he didn't, all he cared about was getting the gospel out and getting people into the kingdom of God. And if you take the focus off of yourself and like how lonely I am or how woe is me, and if you just kind of switch it to the Great Commission, then it changes it changes your mindset about loneliness. And I gotta say, and this is God's grace, but I have not felt lonely at all. And because I have such a great church community, and I have, so many friends. So like when I became a Christian, I got like instant, 100 Christian friends, like who were so loving and supportive and prayed for me and spent time with me. And so I have this whole new family, and where I'm not alone. And I have a relationship with Jesus, so I'm never alone. And I get, that relationship with Christ is so much more satisfying than any other relationship I've ever had. So, I mean, but I do feel for kids who are dealing with this and think like, I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. But it's like, just think of it in a different way of like, how can I further the kingdom of God? Yeah. And like, that's going to be my life. And I'm excited about this, to do this. Yeah.
It's interesting. You keep doing that with the body language, that idea of changing. I mean, because repent, when you look into the Koine Greek, it really does, metanoete means to rethink your thinking. Yeah. Certainly behavior is a part of that, but that's what we are commissioned to do, is to help people rethink their thinking, get out of the cave, if you will, see the world in a different way. Of course, we need the Holy Spirit to do that as well. It was common when I was growing up, people were talking about raising religion neutral kids. I'm going to just let them decide.
Oh, right.
And today they talk about raising gender neutral kids. How are you navigating that? Or I know you've had people on your show.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, like, that is one of the most bizarre phenomena that has happened in the last, 5 years, 10 years. Raising gender neutral kids. I honestly don't understand how a parent would do that or could do that. To me, I had Michael Heiser on my show, and to me, it's like the unseen realm. It's just, there's so much going on in the spiritual realm that is fueling all of this. So I think it's like most of it is a spiritual battle. Paul says we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but the powers and principalities. And so I think a lot of this stuff, this gender neutral, it's demonic. It's like because God created us binary. God created us male and female. He did not create us non-binary. When you're doing this kind of gender neutral stuff, you're fully rebelling against God's creation ordinance. And I think it's also, I think, I don't know, it's almost like the extreme Olympics. It's like how much more bizarre can we make this world is what's happening now. It's like, I mean, it has Marxist undertones, it has all kinds of things going on, but yeah, the gender neutral thing is there are two sexes, male and female, and that's it. And there's not a spectrum. And yeah, you're pretty bold in the way that you say it. And communicate it. But you're not rude or anything like that, right? You have a demeanor about you that I appreciate, and those virtues of gentle and being respectful can still be present even if we are confronting people. I mean, Paul does say in 2 Corinthians 10, we're supposed to tear down arguments that hold itself up to the knowledge of Christ. So part of our spiritual battle is showing, what are the lies, what are the bad arguments, what's massaging us into this direction. That's something I do with my philosophy students in that. So I think that's important. I have one last self-indulging question. Yeah. I think I heard you say once that you went in the backyard at Prince's house for a concert. I mean, come on. That's friends. That's kind of, it seems like would be a cool thing. Yeah, it was a cool thing. My friend he called me and he said, hey, do you want to go to Prince's house? Or do you want to go to this party at Prince's house? I'm like, yeah. And it was up in Benedict Canyon where I used to live up there, but his house. So we get to the guard gate because it's in that community. I forgot what it's called, but it's a private, gates everywhere. And Magic Johnson lives there. All these people live. Jamie Foxx, Prince didn't own the house that we went to. He rented it. I think it was like $200,000 a month to rent this house. Huge. I mean, gigantic. The house was, and the yard was enormous with the swimming pool and, but yeah, when I walked in, I saw the crazy Prince piano, and there was like a purple rug when you walk in, giant rug with a sign on it. And then I looked outside in the back. I could see through the windows in the backyard, and there was a stage set up, and at the very back of the lawn, a stage with the symbol on it. And I was like, oh, he's going to perform tonight. And he performed for 3 hours.
Oh my goodness!
Until he got up, and then he didn't start till like 11:30. So I was exhausted, but I made the mistake. I went up to. He came out on stage, and just without anyone knowing, there were only like 50 people there. He came out on the stage, and I like picked up. I got my phone and I took a picture of him, and he said, he came up to me and he's like, "Oh, I don't look good this late at night. No pictures. Or something like that. Something like, I don't look good. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. And then one of his security guys came and basically almost tackled me. But that was I mean, that's the thing. It's like before I was a Christian, I had all these crazy experiences. I mean, all the time. Like that's just one in a million of experiences I had of like, just what am I doing at this party and these the governor's ball at the Oscars? Like that was my life before. But I got to say, it all pales in comparison to my life with Christ.
I have greatly appreciated the conversation. I could keep talking to you. I hope it was fun for you. I really enjoy, hearing about your story, the changes, but really most importantly, just the joy you exude in being a part of the kingdom. And I'm glad you were a part.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Yeah. It's a little bit different than talking about astrophysics and biochem, but it is a lot of fun.
Yes.
Nonetheless. Well, if you want to hear more from Becket Cook, you can certainly go to his podcast. We will put a link for you to do that. We greatly appreciate his time and partnership here at Reasons to Believe. We thank you for listening and hope you will look forward to more from Reasons to Believe.